At 9:58 in the morning on March 3, 1943, Major Paul Gunn sat inside the pilot seat of a B-25 bomber called Margaret, watching the horizon over the Bismarck Sea swing sharply to the left. He was moving at 200 miles per hour, but he wasn't flying up high. He was just 50 feet above the water, low enough to see the white tips of the waves, low enough to feel the salty mist hitting the glass in front of him. Straight ahead, through the morning haze, sat a Japanese warship. It was a 2,000-ton steel hunter covered with guns built especially to shoot down airplanes like his. The Army handbook said this move was certain death. The handbook said a medium bomber should fly at 8,000 feet, dropping bombs while flying straight and steady. The handbook said flying straight at a warship at the height of its masts was a sure way to die. Paul Gunn didn't care about the handbook. He cared about the firing button under his thumb. He wasn't aiming through a fancy bomb sight. He was looking through a plain metal ring fixed to the front of the plane. He waited. The warship grew bigger through the glass. He could see the Japanese sailors running around on deck. He could see the barrels of their fast-firing 25mm guns turning, locking onto his airplane's nose. The space between them shrank 1,000 yards, 800 yards. The designers back in California had warned him this wouldn't work. They had told him that if he pressed the trigger now, the kickback from the weapon setup he had attached to the front would break the glass, twist the metal frame, and maybe even stop the engines from working. They had called his idea a mechanic's wild dream. They had laughed at the springs he found in a junkyard to soften the shock. Gunn tightened his hands on the steering column. He wasn't a test pilot, and he wasn't a designer. He was a 43-year-old dad whose wife and 4 kids was starving inside a Japanese prison camp in Manila. He pressed the trigger. The front of the B-25 didn't just shoot, it exploded. 850 caliber machine guns fired all at once. That meant 120 bullets left the airplane every single second. The kickback hit the plane's body like a car crash. The bomber shook hard. The metal pins screamed, and the cockpit filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder, but the glass stayed whole and the springs held firm. Down on the water, the Japanese warship didn't disappear in a small puff of smoke. It started falling apart under the force of a chainsaw built from bullets. To understand why a 43-year-old major was flying a bomber like a fighter plane, you need to check the score. In late 1942, the United States Army Air Force was losing badly. They were losing because they were trying to fight a war with numbers that didn't work. The plan was built around the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Norden bomb site. The generals in Washington believed that a B-17 flying at 20,000 feet could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. That was the exact phrase they used to explain the war to regular people. Pickle barrel accuracy. It sounded wonderful in a movie shown in theaters. It was a complete failure in real life. In the Pacific Ocean, the targets weren't buildings or train stations that stayed in one place. The targets were ships, Japanese destroyers and troop carriers moving at 30 knots, changing direction across the sea. When a B-17 dropped a bomb from 20,000 feet, that bomb took almost 40 seconds to reach the water. During those 40 seconds, a Japanese ship captain could turn his vessel, light a cigarette, and watch the bomb splash harmlessly into the ocean half a mile away. The numbers were embarrassing. In the first year of the war, high-flying bombers had less than a 1% chance of hitting moving ships. They were burning millions of gallons of airplane fuel just to kill fish. Meanwhile, the Japanese were running the Tokyo Express. This was a steady line of fast ships moving thousands of soldiers into New Guinea. They were bringing more troops to their bases at Lae and Salamaua, building a strong wall north of Australia. If they landed enough men, they would control the airstrips. If they controlled the airstrips, they could bomb Australia until it gave up. The Allied leader in the Southwest Pacific, General George Kenney, read the reports and saw the truth. His big bombers were no good against ships. He didn't need a careful tool that worked from miles away. He needed a heavy hammer that worked at point-blank range. Kenney had a problem, though. He didn't have a special attack airplane. He had the B-25 Mitchell. The Mitchell was a solid plane, a medium bomber, quick and tough, but it was built for the wrong kind of war. It had a glass front where a bomb dropper sat on a small seat looking through a carefully adjusted sight. It carried a few light machine guns for protection, mostly pointing backward to scare away enemy fighters. It was a defensive weapon meant to run away after dropping its bombs. Kenney needed a plane that charged straight into the fight. He needed a ship killer. Enter Paul Irvin Gunn. The men called him Pappy because at 43 he was old by flying standards. Most pilots in the Pacific were 21-year-old boys who had learned to fly over Iowa cornfields just 6 months before. Gunn had been flying since the 1920s. He had been a Navy pilot, then a regular airline pilot in the Philippines. He knew the jungle, he knew the islands, and he knew machines. But Pappy Gunn wasn't pushed by love of country or duty. He was pushed by a cold, hard anger that scared the younger officers. When the Japanese took over the Philippines in 1941, Gunn had escaped in a damaged plane. His wife Polly and their 4 children had not escaped. They were caught in Manila and locked inside the Santo Tomas prison camp. Gunn knew exactly what happened in those camps. He knew about the hunger, the sickness, and the cruelty. Every extra day the war continued was another day his children might die. He didn't have time for army rules. He didn't have time for practice flights or meetings with committees. He walked into General Kenny's office in Brisbane, Australia, and suggested something crazy. He wanted to take the B-25, remove the bomb dropper, remove the bomb sight, and turn the glass front into a gun nest. He wanted to pack 4 fixed 50-caliber machine guns into the nose, plus 2 more in boxes on the sides, plus lock the top gun turret to face forward. He wanted to turn a medium bomber into a flying shotgun with more front-facing firepower than a tank. General Kenny was desperate enough to say yes. He gave Gunn a hangar in Brisbane and told him to make it happen. But when the engineers from North American Aviation, the company that made the B-25, heard about the plan, they didn't just say no. They laughed out loud. They sent papers explaining the basic rules of physics to the confused major. The front of a B-25 was a greenhouse. It was a light frame of aluminum strips holding clear plastic panels. It was built to hold the weight of 1 man and a 15-pound bomb sight. The engineers explained the power of the 50-caliber Browning M2 machine gun. This wasn't a regular rifle. It was a heavy piece of factory equipment. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. It fired a bullet as thick as a finger at 2,900 feet per second. The kickback energy from one gun was huge. Gunn wanted to put 4 of them in the front. The math was clear. If you fired 4 50s at the same time from that mounting spot, the kickback force would tear the metal pins loose. The front section would literally break off the main body of the plane. Even if the frame stayed together, the shaking would smash the glass right away, making the pilot blind. And even if the glass held, the weight of the guns and thousands of bullets would move the balance point so far forward that the plane would be impossible to fly. It would dive nose first into the runway the moment the wheels left the ground. They called it the suicide box. They told Kenny that Gunn was going to kill his pilots before they ever saw the Japanese. Gunn read the papers, then he threw them in the garbage. He wasn't building a plane to pass a safety check. He was building a plane to sink the ships that were feeding the prison guards in Manila. He went to the scrap piles at the Royal Australian Air Force Base. He didn't search for airplane quality aluminum. He searched for steel. He found old shock absorbers, heavy springs, and soft pads used for big machines. Gunn's idea was simple. The engineers were thinking of a stiff mount. If you bolted the guns straight to the frame, yes, the frame would break, but Gunn wasn't going to bolt them tight. He was going to let them float. He designed a spider mount, a strange setup of steel tubes and flat pieces that held the 4 heavy guns in the middle of the nose. The guns would sit on a holder that could slide backward. Behind the holder, he put his collected springs and shock absorbers. The plan was that when the guns fired, the whole group would kick back into the springs, which would soak up the energy before it reached the delicate aluminum frame. It was garage-style engineering. It looked ugly. It added hundreds of pounds of extra weight to the front. The young mechanics in the hangar looked at the setup and shook their heads. They called it Pappy's kickback toy. They whispered that the old man had finally lost his mind. You couldn't just guess at how air moves. You couldn't fix a balance problem with a welding tool and a feeling, but Gunn kept working. He cut holes in the plastic glass for the gun barrels. He ran bullet paths through the navigator's space, turning the floor into a river of empty brass shells. He attached bubble packs onto the plane's skin, adding 2 more guns just under the pilot's window. By the time he finished, the B-25 Strafer looked like a monster put together from spare parts. It had guns sticking out of every side. It was front-heavy, ugly, and completely against the rules. The official guide for the B-25 Mitchell listed the maximum weapons as enough for protection. Pappy Gunn had just attached enough firepower to slice a building in half. Now he just had to prove it could fly without shaking itself apart. The morning of the first practice flight, the airfield in Brisbane was quiet. It was the kind of quiet you feel before someone is put to death. The mechanics on the flight line stood back, arms folded, watching the strange front-level beast roll to the end of the runway. The engineers from North American Aviation had already written their reports. They had given up on the situation. They claimed the balance point was now so far forward that the front wheel would collapse when it touched down, or the plane would simply refuse to lift off the ground. They warned that if Major Gunn fired those guns while in the air, the shaking would knock the instrument panel loose, leaving the pilot flying blind inside a cloud of his own smoke. To them, this wasn't a new idea. It was $1 million of government property being driven into a grave by a crazy man. Pappy Gunn sat alone in the cockpit. No second pilot, no crew. He wasn't going to risk anyone else's life on a guess. He pushed the power levers forward. The twin Cyclone engines roared, 3,400 horsepower pulling against the brakes. The plane shook. It felt heavy, slow, like a truck loaded with wet cement. He let go of the brakes. The B-25 rolled heavily down the runway. It didn't want to fly. The nose felt stuck to the ground, weighed down by the steel guns, the bullets, and the heavy iron mounts. The end of the runway rushed toward him. The engineers watched, expecting the tires to burst or the plane to crash into the dirt. At the very last moment, Gunn pulled hard on the steering column. The nose groaned upward. The wheels cleared the ground by inches. The strafer was in the air. He climbed to 2,000 feet and headed for the coast. This was the moment of truth. Flying the heavy beast was one thing. Firing it was another. Gunn leveled out over the ocean. He armed the system. His thumb hovered over the electric switch on the control wheel. He wasn't just shooting guns. He was setting off a controlled explosion inside the airplane's body. He pressed the button. The reaction was instant and frightening. The plane actually slowed down while in the air. The kickback force of 850 caliber machine guns firing together acted like a brake, knocking speed off the airplane. Inside the cockpit, the noise was overwhelming, a constant hammering roar that drowned out the engines. The cockpit filled with the sharp smell of burning gunpowder. The floor became a shaking plate, but the front stayed attached. The glass didn't break. Gunn's spider mount, that ugly mix of scrap metal springs and oil shocks, was working perfectly. It was soaking up the violent kick of the guns, letting the weapons slide back and forth just tiny bits, eating the energy before it could rip the metal pins out of the aluminum skin. Gunn watched the glowing bullets curve down into the water. They didn't spread out like water from a loose hose. They came together. At 1,000 yards, the streams of bullets met in a tight, focused cone of destruction. He wasn't spraying an area. He was drilling a hole. Gunn landed the plane and rolled back to the hangar. The mechanics who had laughed at his kickback toy walked up to the aircraft. They saw the black marks on the nose. They smelled the gunpowder, but they didn't see any cracks from stress. They didn't see popped metal pins. The crazy old man had done it. He had built a gunship that broke the maker's rules. But Gunn knew that building the gun was only half the problem. A gun is useless if you don't have a way to deliver the killing blow. The 50 calibers could tear up the deck of a ship, kill the crew, and start fires, but they couldn't sink a 6,000-ton transport ship. For that, you needed bombs, and dropping bombs from 50 feet was a great way to blow yourself out of the sky. This was the second part of Gunn's impossible puzzle. He had to teach a group of pilots trained to fly straight and level at 8,000 feet to fly like crazy people. He called it skip bombing. The idea was old. It was exactly like skipping a flat rock across a pond. If you threw the rock at a steep angle, it splashed and sank. If you threw it low and hard, parallel to the water, it skipped. Gunn wanted to do the same thing with a 500-pound bomb. The science was simple, but doing it was terrifying. To make a bomb skip, the airplane had to be flying at 200 miles per hour, perfectly level, at a height of no more than 50 feet. If the pilot dropped the bomb too high, it would dive into the water and miss the ship. If he dropped it too low, the splash from the bomb hitting the water could hit the tail of the plane and crash it. And then there was the explosion. A 500-pound bomb has a deadly blast area that reaches hundreds of feet into the air. If you drop it from 50 feet, the blast will tear the wings off your own plane before you can fly away. The answer was a timed fuse. Gunn and the weapon experts set the fuses to a 4 to 5 second delay. The bomb would hit the water, skip across the surface like a stone, smash into the side of the Japanese ship, sink below the waterline, and then explode. Those 5 seconds gave the pilot exactly enough time to pull up, push the engines to emergency power, and escape the blast area. The training was harsh. Gunn found an old shipwreck, the SS Pruth, sitting on a reef off the coast at Port Moresby. It became the most bombed piece of scrap metal in the Pacific. The pilots hated it at first. It felt wrong. Every instinct they had learned in flight school screamed at them to pull up. The ocean rushed by so fast it blurred at the edges of their vision. They had to fight the urge to stare at the water. They had to focus completely on the target. But Gunn was unstoppable. He flew with them. He sat in the second pilot's seat shouting over the engine noise, forcing them lower, lower, get lower. If you aren't making waves with your propellers, you're too damn high. This was where the strafer idea finally made sense. The pilots realized why they needed the guns. In a normal bombing run, the plane is an easy target for the ship's anti-aircraft fire. The ship's gunners have a clear shot at the incoming bomber, but with Gunn's gun setup, the bomber shot back. As the pilot began his run 2 miles away, he opened fire with the nose guns. He sprayed the deck of the ship. He killed the anti-aircraft crews. He smashed the bridge. He forced the captain to duck for cover. By the time the bomber was close enough to drop the bomb, the ship wasn't fighting back. It was being held down by a wall of bullets. The B-25 wasn't just a bomber anymore. It was a suppression weapon that delivered a finishing blow. General Kenny saw the results of the training and immediately ordered every available B-25 to be changed. There wasn't time to send them back to the factory in California. They had to do it in the jungle. Gunn organized a production line in the dirt at Port Moresby. It was a scene of organized disorder. Mechanics worked day and night, removing the glass noses from bombers, welding steel plates, cutting holes for barrels, and bolting on the heavy spider mounts. They took parts from wrecked planes. They stole metal from supply areas. They worked through tropical rainstorms and sickness outbreaks. They weren't building pretty airplanes. They were building street fighters. By late February 1943, Gunn had a group of these mixed planes ready. They were ugly. The paint didn't match. The noses were covered in black soot. But the pilots had changed. They walked differently. They weren't high-altitude bus drivers anymore. They were hunters. They knew they had a weapon that the Japanese didn't understand and couldn't stop. They had practiced on the wreck of the Pruth until they could put a bomb through a specific window at 200 miles per hour. But shooting at a rusty wreck is different from shooting at a destroyer that shoots back. The test came sooner than anyone expected. Secret reports began to arrive from coast watchers and code breakers. The Japanese were making their move. A huge group of ships had gathered at Rabaul, the main Japanese stronghold in the area. 8 destroyers, 8 large troop carriers, thousands of soldiers. They were heading for the Huon Gulf. This wasn't a supply mission. It was an invasion force. If those troops landed at Lae, the Allied hold on New Guinea would be destroyed. The Tokyo Express was coming, and this time it was bringing the whole army. The weather turned bad. A tropical storm moved into the Solomon Sea, creating a wall of rain and low clouds. The Japanese leaders were counting on this. They knew the Americans depended on high-altitude bombing. They knew the B-17s couldn't aim at ships through heavy cloud cover. They believed the storm would hide their movement, allowing them to slip through the wet quiet and land their troops without losing a single man. They were right about the B-17s. The flying fortresses were stuck on the ground or flying blind, unable to see the ocean below. The Japanese thought they were safe, but they didn't know about the changes happening in the mud at Port Moresby. They didn't know that the Americans had stopped looking down from the high sky. They didn't know that a new kind of aircraft was sitting on the runway, engines running, waiting for the signal. These planes didn't need clear skies at 20,000 feet. They liked the clouds. They liked the low ceiling. It gave them cover. It let them sneak in at wave-top height, invisible until it was too late. On March 1st, a single B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the convoy through a break in the storm. The radio message went back to headquarters. 14-ship convoy heading west. The location was marked on maps. The speed was figured out. They were heading into the Bismarck Sea. The trap was set. General Kenny looked at the map. He looked at the reports from his weather experts. The storm was expected to clear in 2 days. He looked at Pappy Gunn. The time for welding and testing was over. The theory of the kickback spring and the skip bomb was about to be tested against 16 warships and 7,000 men who were ready to die for their emperor. The order went out to the squadrons clearing weather expected. Maximum effort. Crews were briefed in hot, damp tents. They were shown the shapes of the Japanese destroyers. Arashio, Tokitsukaze fast modern warships with 5-inch guns and groups of 25mm fast cannons. The pilots looked at the blurry spy photos. They looked at their own change planes with their short-nosed machine guns and their heavy bomb loads. There was no backup plan. If Gunn's crazy idea failed, the B-25s would be shot out of the sky like insects, and the Japanese army would flood into New Guinea. On the morning of March 3rd, the clouds began to lift. The Bismarck Sea lay flat and grey. The Japanese convoy moved in a tight protective formation, the destroyers circling the transports, guns ready, eyes scanning the high sky, waiting for the B-17s. They were looking up. They should have been looking down. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stopped being a battle and started being an execution. The Japanese captains on the destroyers were experienced men. They knew how American air power worked. They expected the high sound of heavy engines at 20,000 feet. They expected to see tiny black dots releasing bombs that would take 40 seconds to fall. They had their steering men ready to turn the wheels hard to the right or left, dodging the bombs with ease. They were looking at the clouds, waiting for the B-17s. They were playing a game of chess against a master who was moving very slowly. They didn't realize that Pappy Gunn had flipped the chessboard over and pulled out a knife. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound. It was a shape. Out of the mist on the horizon, a group of aircraft appeared, but they weren't the high-altitude dots the Japanese were trained to spot. These planes were hugging the water, flying so low that propellers were kicking up spray from the ocean surface. Leading the attack were Australian bow fighters, heavy twin-engine fighters with 4 cannons in the nose. They came in first, acting as the suppression team, raking the decks of the destroyers to force the gun crews to keep their heads down. Then came the B-25s, the Strafers, the 90th Squadron, the 30th Group. They came in line abreast, a wall of aluminum moving at 200 miles per hour. Inside the lead bomber, the pilot lined up on the destroyer Arashio. The Japanese ship was a 2,000-ton monster, covered with weapons. In a normal fight, the destroyer wins this battle. Its 5-inch main guns can destroy a bomber 3 miles away. Its 25mm fast cannons can tear apart an airplane at 1 mile, but the Arashio couldn't fire its main guns at a target flying 10 feet off the water. The barrels couldn't point down low enough, and the fast cannon crews were staring down the barrels of something they had never seen before. The B-25 pilot flipped the electric switch. This was the moment the North American Aviation engineers had warned about. This was the moment the front was supposed to break off. The pilot pressed the trigger. The kickback spring system, that ugly, quickly built setup of junkyard springs and shock absorbers, slammed backward. The whole airplane body groaned under the pressure. The cockpit shook so hard the instruments blurred. But the metal pins held, the glass held, and from the front of the plane a solid stream of armor-piercing, fire-starting bullets erupted. 850 caliber machine guns firing together creates a density of fire that is hard to imagine. It's not just bullets. It's a physical force. The rounds didn't just hit the Arashio. They took it apart. They punched through the steel walls of the bridge. They shredded the thin metal of the gun positions. They turned the deck into a killing field. The Japanese gunners didn't have time to aim. They were cut down where they stood. The kickback system worked so well that the pilots could hold the trigger down for 3, 4, 5 seconds. They could move the fire from the front of the ship to the back, spraying it like they were washing a driveway, but the machine guns were just the opener. The bomb was the real weapon. The pilot held the dive until the destroyer filled the whole windshield. At 300 yards, he was staring into the eyes of the terrified men on the bridge. He dropped the bomb. A 500-pound cylinder of high explosive fell from the bay. It didn't fall, it flew. It hit the water at a shallow angle, skipping off the surface like a flat stone thrown by a giant. It bounced once, twice, 3 times. It smashed into the side of the Arashio right at the waterline. The delay fuse ticked. 1 second, 2 seconds. The B-25 roared directly over the ship's mast, the pilot pulling back on the stick, the engine screaming. 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The bomb exploded. The blast didn't go up. It went inward. It blew a hole the size of a garage door in the side of the destroyer. The shock wave lifted the 2,000-ton ship out of the water. The engine rooms flooded instantly. The Arashio broke in two. This scene was happening across the whole convoy. The Japanese formation broke apart. The troop carriers, fat, slow ships carrying thousands of soldiers, were helpless. They had depended on the destroyers for protection, but the destroyers were burning. Pappy Gunn's pilots turned toward the transports like wolves attacking sheep. They lined up for their runs. They didn't even need the bombs for the softer targets. The 50 calibers were enough. The heavy bullets tore through the unarmored sides of the transport ships. They set fire to the fuel drums stored on the decks. They exploded the ammunition boxes stacked in the holds. One B-25 pilot, Major Ed Lana, took his plane so low that he had to pull up to avoid hitting the mast of a transport. As he flew over, his rear gunner shot at the deck from behind. The ship was the Kyokusei Maru. It was carrying airplane fuel. When the skip bombs hit it, the ship didn't just sink, it vanished. A fireball rose 1,000 feet into the air. The B-25, flying behind Lana, had to fly through the fireball. The paint on its wings bubbled from the heat. The pilot came out the other side, shaken and trembling, but still flying. The ship killer idea was working with frightening efficiency. The skip bombing method was proving to be deadly accurate. At high altitude, a 10% hit rate was considered excellent. At mast height, the B-25s were hitting nearly 50% of the time. They weren't missing. They were putting bombs into the engine rooms of moving ships. The Japanese captains tried to turn, tried to zigzag, but you can't outrun an airplane flying at 200 knots. The B-25s would simply circle, wait for the ship to commit to a turn, and then strike from the side. By noon, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. The destroyer Tokitsukaze was dead in the water, sinking. The Asashio was burning from front to back. All 8 transports were hit. Most were sinking or already gone. The water was covered in a thick layer of oil, broken pieces, and thousands of struggling survivors. The B-25s ran out of bombs, but they didn't go home. They came back for more shooting runs. They used the kickback spring guns to finish off the damaged ships. They punched holes in the lifeboats. They shot at the floating wreckage. It was harsh industrial killing. It was war without mercy. But the pilots remembered the reports from Bataan. They remembered the stories of American prisoners being killed. They remembered Pappy Gunn's family in Manila. They kept shooting until the barrels of their guns glowed red-hot and the bullet paths were empty. Back at the base, the ground crews waited. They heard the sound of engines returning. They counted the planes. They were all coming back. Some had holes in the wings. Some had pieces of Japanese ship ribs stuck in their landing gear. One B-25 landed with a crushed front wheel, not from a bad landing, but because it had hit the smokestack of a sinking transport. The pilots climbed out of the cockpits. They were soaked in sweat, their hands shaking from the excitement and the vibration. They walked into the briefing hut and threw their flight helmets on the table. General Kenny looked at the reports. He couldn't believe the numbers. In one morning, Pappy Gunn's suicide boxes had done more damage to the Japanese Navy than the entire 5th Air Force had done in the previous 6 months. The high-altitude B-17s, which had also joined in the attack, claimed a few hits, but the spy photos told the real story. The ships had holes in their sides right at the waterline. That was the mark of the skip bomb. The decks were torn up, the bridges destroyed. That was the mark of the strafer nose. The impossible physics of the kickback system had held up. The springs had soaked up the energy of hundreds of thousands of bullets. The mounts hadn't cracked. The glass hadn't shattered. The engineers who had made fun of the idea, who had written the papers about balance points and stress cracks, were silent. The math had said it couldn't be done. The wreckage burning in the Bismarck Sea said otherwise. That evening, the Tokyo Express stopped existing. The Japanese high command in Rabaul was in shock. They had lost a whole division of troops. They had lost important destroyers. They had lost the ability to bring more soldiers to New Guinea by sea. They sent a message to Tokyo. The enemy has created a new kind of bombing. It is extremely low and extremely accurate. They didn't know it was the work of a 43-year-old major with a welder and a personal grudge. They just knew that the Bismarck Sea was now closed to shipping. The victory was complete. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, over 3,000 Japanese troops killed. The Americans lost 13 men. It was one of the most one-sided victories in the history of sea battles, and it was won by a plane that wasn't supposed to exist using a method that the handbook said was suicide. Fired through a mounting system made of scrap metal, Pappy Gunn walked out to the flight line that night. He touched the nose of his B-25. The metal was cool now. The soot was thick on the aluminum. He checked the springs on the mount. They were squeezed tight, worn out, but not broken. He lit a cigarette and looked north toward the Philippines. He had killed many men that day. He had sunk many ships, but he knew it wasn't enough. His family was still in Santo Tomas. The war wasn't over. He would have to build more planes. He would have to find more guns. He would have to kill more destroyers, and God help anyone who told him it was impossible. The quiet that followed the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was louder than the gunfire. In the officers' clubs in Brisbane and the offices of North American Aviation in California, the laughter stopped. The kickback spring wasn't a joke anymore. It was the new rule. The engineers who had written long papers explaining why the B-25 would fall apart if you put machine guns in the nose now had to explain why a mechanic in the jungle had outsmarted their whole design team. They didn't send an apology. They sent a group of draftsmen with measuring tools. They arrived at Gunn's open-air workshop in Port Moresby, sweating in their clean uniforms holding clipboards. They climbed over the soot-covered, battle-used B-25s. They measured the thickness of the steel plates. They drew pictures of the ugly, welded spider mounts. They poked at the collected shock absorbers. They realized that while the math said this shouldn't fly, the reality of combat said it was the deadliest medium bomber in the world. The factory people did exactly what smart men do when they've been beaten. They stole the idea. They packed up their drawings, flew back to the United States, and started building the B-25J. When the new J models rolled off the assembly line in Kansas City, they didn't have a glass nose for a bomb dropper. They had a solid metal nose packed with 850 caliber machine guns installed at the factory using a better version of Pappy Gunn's suspension system. They called it the Straffer model. The handbook was rewritten. The suicide box became the standard setup for the rest of the war. Gunn didn't get a patent. He didn't get a payment for each plane. He just got the satisfaction of watching thousands of factory-made copies of his impossible plane arrive in the Pacific to finish the job he started. But Gunn wasn't finished. The victory at the Bismarck Sea didn't satisfy him. It just proved that his method worked. His family was still in Santo Tomas. The Japanese were still in the Philippines, so Gunn kept pushing further. If 50 caliber machine guns were good, he decided a cannon would be better. He took a 75mm field artillery piece, a weapon built to be pulled by a truck and fired from the ground, and decided to push it into the nose of a B-25. The kickback of a 75mm cannon is like getting hit by a freight train. When he test-fired it, the plane almost stopped in midair. The metal pins popped loose. The structure groaned, but he made it work. He created a flying tank destroyer that could sink a ship with a single shell from 2 miles away. He flew these monster planes until his body started to give out. In late 1944, during a mission over the Philippines, Gunn's luck finally ran out. He was shot down. His plane crashed into the jungle. He survived, but he was badly burned by white phosphorus. He lost a finger. His arm was ruined. The flight doctors took one look at him and signed the papers to ground him forever. They told him his war was over. He was a 45-year-old man with a broken hand and serious burns. He should have been on a hospital ship heading to San Francisco. Gunn ignored the doctors the same way he ignored the engineers. He wasn't leaving until he opened the gates of Santo Tomas. He talked his way back onto flight duty. He flew supplies. He flew spy missions. He flew anything with wings. When General MacArthur finally returned to the Philippines, waiting on shore at Leyte, Pappy Gunn was flying overhead. He was watching the ground, counting the miles to Manila. On February 3, 1945, the nightmares ended. The 1st Cavalry Division broke through the gates of the Santo Tomas prison camp. They found 3,700 civilians who were barely alive. They were skeletons, starving, surviving on less than 700 calories a day. Among the walking ghosts were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years of hell. They had survived the hunger, the sickness, and the cruelty of the guards. When Pappy Gunn finally walked into that camp, he wasn't the famous ship killer. He was just a husband and a father who had spent every waking moment of the last 3 years trying to build a machine violent enough to save them. He found them alive. That was the only victory that mattered. The ships at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, the medals on his chest, the history books, none of it meant anything compared to the moment he put his arms around his wife. The anger that had powered him, the cold fury that had allowed him to turn a bomber into a killing machine, finally disappeared. After the war, the Air Force tried to keep him. They offered him promotions, a desk at the Pentagon, a chance to teach the next generation of engineers. Gunn turned them down. He had no interest in peacetime office work. He had no interest in wearing a uniform when there was no one left to fight. He stayed in the Philippines. He loved the islands. He started a regular airline, Philippine Airlines. He went back to doing what he did before the world caught fire, flying people and cargo over the jungle, fixing engines with wire and landing on dirt strips that scared younger pilots. But men like Pappy Gunn don't die in bed. They don't fade away in a retirement home playing shuffleboard. They live by the machine, and eventually the machine takes them. On January 16, 1957, Gunn was flying a Beechcraft Bonanza through a storm near Manila. He was 57 years old. He had survived the Japanese Navy, the jungle, plane crashes, and phosphorus burns. He had survived the doubters and the generals, but he couldn't survive the weather. The plane went down. Pappy Gunn died right away. His legacy isn't sitting in a museum case. It's flying over battlefields today. Every time you see an A-10 Warthog, a plane that is basically a giant gun with wings wrapped around it, you are looking at the great-grandchild of Pappy Gunn's B-25. Every time you see an AC-130 gunship circling a target, pouring fire from the side, you are seeing the grown-up version of the strafer idea. Gunn proved that in war the person who changes fastest wins. He proved that the handbook is just a suggestion and that an engineer with a welding tool and a reason to fight is more dangerous than a group of experts. Most history books focus on the admirals and the generals. They talk about Nimitz and MacArthur. They talk about big strategy and ship movements. But the war in the Pacific wasn't won by arrows on a map. It was won by guys like Pappy Gunmen who looked at a problem, realized the official answer was going to get them killed, and built their own answer out of scrap metal. He took a defensive bomber and turned it into an attack weapon that broke the back of the Japanese merchant navy. He did it while everyone told him he was crazy. He did it while they laughed at his kickback spring, and he did it for the simplest reason of all. He just wanted to get his kids back. If this story moved you, if you believe that new ideas often come from the guys with dirty hands rather than the guys in suits, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the computer system that these stories matter. It helps us find more forgotten heroes like Pappy Gunn. And make sure you're subscribed. We are digging through old records every day looking for the men and women who changed history with nothing but determination and a refusal to give up. Drop a comment below and tell us what is the craziest field fix you've ever heard of. Have you ever had to repair something when the expert said it was broken forever? We want to hear your stories. We read every single comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. We say these stories to make sure poor Pappy Gunn doesn't disappear into silence.